From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. We've got a very exciting program today. We're going to take a look at the emergence of the women's movement in Montana in the 1970s. As you know, we're addressing this as a period of progressive change in Montana, and nothing more exemplifies both the challenge and the change than what happened with the women's movement in Montana. Our history is very interesting in that regard, and we're going to look into that a little bit. If you think about the fact that in 1914, 100 years ago, women were given the right to vote in Montana before it was provided legally under the Constitution of the United States. So we were ahead of the curve. 2 years thereafter, we elected Jeanette Rankin as the first woman member of Congress. Those signature accomplishments in the early part of the 20th century were followed by a period where economically the copper collar was tightened around Montana, but sociologically progress was not greatly being shown. And so as we reached the 70s, there were some really great challenges, but great opportunities. Now we have a wonderful panel that we're going to be working with tonight, and I want to introduce them all now, and then we'll come and we'll start the discussion. And I want to mention that, of course, that we are all friends. We've known each other for many years, many years. And because of that, we're going to have a conversation. And it's a wonderful thing. But our panelists here, Jane Jelinski. Jane was a county commissioner for many years from Gallatin County, and then she went to work for the Montana Association of Counties, kind of overlooking all those county commissioners, and ultimately with the local government center at Montana State University. And so she's had her teeth in this stuff on the electoral side and the understanding things in a broader context for many years. Now we also have Dorothy Bradley. Dorothy, I think, is one of the more well-known women leaders of Montana, and was a legislator for many years, 2 cycles as legislators. You know, you had your cycle and then you went away and you came back again. And not only that, you were a candidate for Congress and the nominee for governor. And people know you very well for what you've stood for over the years, and we're so happy to have you here as well. And Marilyn Wessel. Marilyn, I first ran into Marilyn. She was a broadcaster.
That's right.
She was a broadcaster down at, which was the station?
KBMN
KBMN Radio, and what a great voice you had. We always loved it. And Marilyn later left broadcasting and went to administration at Montana State University, and then a long term running our most prominent and preeminent museums in Montana, the Museum of the Rockies. And so let's start a little bit with you, Marilyn, in terms of that context. I mentioned a couple of highlights in the earlier part of the century, but tell us when it came to women in Montana and their position in Montana, both legally and sociologically, what was the context we were facing?
Well, it was an exciting time for all of us, I think. We are your senior feminist panel here, so we've lived through it all. It's been wonderful. But there were some things going on that really helped to create the rebirth of the feminist movement in Montana. Great literature. Let's don't forget Betty Friedan and her wonderful book that came out in that era. The Equal Pay Act passed the United States Congress in the 60s. We had Title IX, which equalized money for women in sports, also in the 60s. This is great federal legislation. Then on the statewide basis, we had the Montana Constitution, a brand new constitution in Montana with a very strong equal rights provision in it. We also had the federal equal rights amendment that came out of the U.S. Congress in 1971, and came out to the states for ratification. So there were many things going on to get women involved, but there were also plenty of problems, Evan. This was not necessarily a good time for women. We worry about the pay gap now, but then women made 49 cents for every dollar a man made. This is in 1974. There were many jobs that were closed to us. Promotion was closed to women, either from tradition or from legalistic means. Issues of choice were not in our control in any way that we could see. Childcare. There were many, many problems for women in that era. So we, along with many other women in the state, we are talking for many people, not just ourselves, both newcomers and native to Montana in the 1970s, formed various coalitions and groups to do a couple of main things. One was to get more women elected to office, which was very important to us. We had only 2 women serving in the Montana legislature when we all got started thinking about these things. Dorothy was one of them. And the other issue was to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified. This was, after all, Jeanette Rankin's home state. We really wanted to see the Equal Rights Amendment added to the Constitution. So those were 2 areas around which we coalesced, along with wanting to change the way people saw women. We looked at that Constitutional Convention delegation with all those women on it, and we thought, we deserve a seat at the table. They are leading the way, and if we could, we wanted to be at the head of the table. So we really wanted to see change come about, and those were some of the things that lent that.
Well, you know, when you think about the Constitutional Convention, 19 women out of 100 delegates, and that was such a phenomenal advancement, and yet if we think about it, geez, that's 19%.
I know.
You know, I mean,
not huge.
And demographically, women are more than 50% of the population. So a reapportionment, which required a representation of people in the legislative structure, didn't address demographics, and so that had to come a different way. But could you? I'm thinking about back in those days, some of the terminology was interesting. And it almost sounds a little bit crude, but I remember people actually saying it, and meaning it, that, you know, women needed to be barefoot, pregnant, and chained to the stove. And
it was an
that's
unfunny
a sociological
joke.
thing.
A very unfunny joke.
Yeah.
We did not take kindly to it, and one of the things we early feminists did was we stopped laughing at those things. At one point they had perhaps been funny, but they weren't funny then, and we not only wanted to see legalistic changes and changes in the way women were represented, we really wanted people to look at women in a much more different, much more serious manner. And those kinds of comments were no longer okay, and that was part of our job to say that.
You know, it seemed to me that that those kind of words became an opportunity to look at them in terms of how ridiculous they might be. Although there are some people that still ascribe to those concepts.
Sadly, I'm sure that's true.
I think we're still there. The kind of one of the outlooks that flavored, and I think maybe Jane will go into this a little bit, but it seemed to flavor things a bit, was when you looked at that very pervasive thing of television shows, and how were women reflected in television. And it was like watching Leave It to Beaver. I mean, it was the perfect nuclear household, and the mother was home cooking for the kids who came home from school, and the husband was the breadwinner, and that was the sociological context of the time. reflected on TV, which helped intensify it in a sense.
Well, none of us was June Cleaver, nor did we want to be. We didn't denigrate women who wanted to live their lives that way. It was all about being able to choose the sort of lifestyle that you had. But there were economic factors that were changing this country in the 1970s, and for the most part, the one-income household was no longer really possible. Households really needed to have two earners, and that was something that I think made it more critical for women to be able to advance themselves and feel okay about being in the workplace. It was not an insult to be a working mother or a working woman at that point.
And the world has changed economically so that now the percentage of households where there are two breadwinners is a huge percentage. It's maybe 2/3 right now. I think I saw some numbers on that just the other day. Ironically, of course, with the diminishment of the buying power of the middle class, that 2/3 with two household checks isn't doing modern American families that much good.
That also brought up the issue of childcare for us. That was another one of the things that we all noticed and worked with and dealt with and struggled with when we were young women in the 70s. We needed help in that regard. We were willing to pay for it, but there was not quality daycare available in most cases, and that was also an important part of the feminist movement, was to make sure our kids were well cared for by us and by caregivers that we could hire. So that was an important thing too that went on.
Now you mentioned choice, and we're going to jump over and talk to Dorothy here about that, but it's an opportune time, since we're moving over to talk to you, to say that kind of the role models of women leaders that we could look at and say, wow, that's really something, that we had some of that in our history, again with Jeanette Rankin as an example, but as we entered the 70s, in the late 60s, most of those role models were national level. It was, gee, what do we think about Shirley Chisholm? Well, we had in literature we had Betty Friedan, we had Bella Abzug, and people in Congress who were suddenly emerging, Barbara Jordan, wonderful examples. We didn't have so many here. You were one that people could look up to. When you went to the legislature in 1971, your freshman term, there were only 2 women in the legislature.
It was a very interesting time, and I can't say that being in the legislature had ever been on my list of things to do. I just came plummeting out of college, happened to be in Bozeman for a period of time, and then suddenly this door opened, and I thought, postpone graduate school, do that another day. Finding myself there was absolutely startlingly amazing, and I can't think that I was really well prepared. I wasn't a political science major or anything like that. But I loved the issues, and to this day I love the issues. That's a really important point to remember. But when we talk about what generated the women's movement and fervor of the 70s, choice was certainly one of the key issues. This is pre-Roe versus Wade. And one of the things I do vividly remember was our effort to have a hearing in 1971 when nobody wanted to deal with this issue. There was a bill to legalize abortion, and nobody in that 150 body legislature would introduce it. Nobody really wanted to see it go to me, but finally these people who wanted their day in court, so to speak, came and said, this has to be debated. Would you consider introducing it? I had a great relationship with Tony Rozelle, a really astonishing senator, a Republican, who watched over me. She actually advised me against it, and we talked about it many times after that era. And she said, there's so many things for you to do in the future. You shouldn't get sidetracked by one thing. I appreciated her giving me that warning, but I also thought, if I don't give these people their opportunity, why should I even be here? Nobody else is going to do this. So the bill was introduced, and the upshot is it was one of the most extraordinary, thoughtful, respectful issues ever debated that year. It is such a difficult issue, and everybody knew it was a difficult issue, and they gave it that respect. And when it came time to get it out of committee, there was only 4 other votes besides myself. And I learned several things from that. One I learned, of course, is thank goodness for the Supreme Court of the United States, which passed Roe versus Wade, because we still might be back there then considering our vote. The other is if you stand up and speak your mind and it's thoughtful and considered and respectful, it won't haunt you for the rest of your political life. It is okay. And the third thing is you can't tamp down issues that must be debated. That was an issue of the day. It had to be debated. It was well done. It was as good a debate as we heard on any issue. It was a great learning experience for me.
I wondered about your reflections upon the 148 men that were in the legislature at that time, in terms of them. Some of them obviously were very progressive, but did we not have a situation that exemplified the idea that even really good people could have archaic ideas?
I would just have to say the men of that assembly were wonderful to me and Tony Rozelle. I never had a complaint. And what I always remember is that following the passage of the Montana Constitution and the dignity of the person clause that is so extraordinary, when we followed that up in the legislature with an equality of sexes study to bring Montana laws into compliance with what our constitutional statement was, a totally fabulous, smart, soft-spoken, self-deprecating lawyer from Livingston, Dan Yardley, ran that study to perfection, bringing these complicated laws, things we had never even thought about, into compliance with the Constitution. What it takes is all of us working together. And somehow, while he brought that study into being and focused everybody on the difficult issues of the day, it was very considered and deliberative. And outside this little cocoon was raging the Equal Rights Amendment at the same time. And its shrill and fear-mongering approach was so different than the process that Montana went through to create statutes that were fair to everybody.
It's interesting that the political world was burning up, so to speak, and you're saying inside the legislature, people were at least being thoughtful and considerate about the issues, even though they were having to vote on some of them that they didn't like.
I think that study, it was almost like we were on a sacred mission. You know, we're implementing the Constitution, and it's our sacred document, and we're bringing equality to a huge group of people. There were 12 bills. Some of them were a big surprise, like, what? This inequality exists? I always think of the penalties of prostitution, and you think that most prostitutes are women, and therefore if only women are penalized, there's a discrimination on the basis of gender. So it was proposed that we also penalize patrons. It made sense, it passed. There was a group of bills that were very expansive in broadening rights to everybody. For example, I thought the best of that was the access to fair credit. Credit was not to go to little details about your marital status or your gender or anything else. It was to be based on collateral, character, and credit ratings. And I had people thank me afterward who were totally unexpected. It just didn't expand rights to women or unmarried women. It expanded rights to everybody. And then there was, of course, a huge slew of domestic kinds of legislation. However, what I most remember then is that they extended rights and respect to the spouse in the home. And that was to be a respected part of a marriage. And when a marriage was to be broken up, the property was to be understood to consider the consideration of the work in the household. It brought sort of a new kind of thinking.
So the community property laws gave some kind of respect for the not just the money, not just the earnings outside the home, but
that's correct.
Yeah. Now,
not just the breadwinner, but the person who's in the home, whoever it may be, raising the children, making the household work. It was respected as part of the equation.
I remember when the bill on prostitution, did Pat Regan carry that bill?
She carried the Fair Credit Act.
Excellent guess.
She could have carried
I
that.
always thought that she might have. I kind of remembered it that way, but she was very vociferous about it. And I remember the hallway talk among the lobbyists, which was kind of both, in one sense, respectful, and there was opportunity for some humor in it too. But effectively, the story was the Johns could be nailed as well as the prostitutes, and that seemed like the epitome of equality. You know,
it really brought it to a whole new perspective. And you know, one of the other funny ones, which is the one I carried because I thought it would be the least controversial, was that barbers at that time were allowed to cut women's hair, but beauty salons were not allowed to cut men's hair. I thought that was a no-brainer, and it didn't pass. And if you think about it, oh yeah, there's most of the people serving in these two houses are men, and they all have barbers, and it gave quite a huge amount of strength to the barbers in the community. It was fixed later, but it was the one that didn't pass.
Well, and you know, going back to, we had a previous program on executive reorganization, and one of the things that when I was on that staff, and the first study I had to do of governmental structure, and I was right out of graduate school, and 1 year of teaching, I ended up doing that, was to study the occupational licensing boards. And of course, one of those, and the most outrageous one, was the barbers, who said, if you got to have 20 departments, one of them ought to be the barbers board, because, and with one staff person. But it did speak to the issue that they were very protective. And when you started saying, well, who cuts whose hair? Gee, you're now getting into our bailiwick. And a long time ago, I discovered that the smaller one's area of authority is, the more jealously they guard it.
Well,
they were guarding it, I'll tell you.
We all like franchises.
Yeah. Now let me ask you.
What I would remember always about that effort is when you get down into extending equal rights, you discover there's all kinds of people besides yourself that face discrimination.
Yeah.
And when you deal with equal rights, you expand it for everybody.
And it's important to note, and we've dealt with this a lot in the early feminist movement in the 70s, rights are not finite. Just because women are trying to advance their rights does not mean that men will have fewer rights. Yeah. It's not like we have 100 rights and if I get 60, then you're going to have fewer. The rights are there to be enjoyed by all. It's just a matter of making sure that socially and legislatively we can actually do what we need to do. And we still hear that concern today from young women. If I'm a feminist, does that mean that I don't want rights for men, or that I want fewer rights for men? So that battle was a big one then, and I think it remains an issue for some women today.
I think the word synergy would work on in terms of rights, that when you put them together, they're more than the sum of the parts.
The sum of the parts, that's a very good way to put it.
And so I wanted to ask you about one that got really hot in the legislature was unisex insurance.
Yeah, that was huge.
That got to be pretty hot, and I don't know why. It seemed not to discriminate against women in terms of getting insurance.
Well, everybody dragged their actuarial tables out, you know, and they can get very complicated. And I would just sum it up to say, I think Montana took a very brave step, eventually passed it. You can't, in certain circumstances, make divisions based on sex. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. And that is applied now at the national level with the Affordable Care Act. Has a lot of things in it that are saying we've got to be able to treat women the same as men, or everyone the same at the federal level. It finds its way in, and that, of course, is controversial too for politics. Again, the interesting thing is the external political world kind of pushes on the edges of the policy world and all this kind of stuff, and people are looking for political advantage, and in essence inflaming people and using fear to inflame people politically to get votes often gets in the way of rational political or policy discussion. We see it today, and I'm sure it was prevalent at that time as well.
Very much so, yeah.
And we shouldn't let the discussion go by without noting how these constitutional delegates so totally expanded no discrimination in the state, because it wasn't just a matter of who you could not discriminate against. It was a matter of who is not allowed to discriminate against them. And this was so foresighted. I think to this day it is a model in the rest of the country, because it's not just the state and a public body that may not discriminate. It is a private person, it is a business, it's an institution. It is a matter of law, of constitutional law, that you do not discriminate. It was so expansive. I just think it was remarkable for its day.
You know, in terms of the legal side of this thing, obviously in the hierarchy of laws, statutes have to, you know, be subservient to the constitutional language, which is the stronger guiding document. Did you run into, in the legislature, folks saying, well, not wanting to get that layering of the laws, saying, well, you know, I know you've got this constitutional language, but you're just going way too far here with what you're trying to get done? Did you run into that much? Because I see that today. It's like, well, to hell with the Constitution. This is what we want, you know.
I don't know how I would answer that, Evan. I always felt that I was blessed to be among a group of people whose primary endeavor on these issues was to search them out to the maximum of our ability. I thought it was a really honest assessment and search for what is good.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you bring a seriousness to the debate and a sincerity to the debate that probably helped color the response, you know. So I think a bit of the credit goes with who the messenger was. The message may have been a little uncomfortable for some of those folks, but you as the messenger, I think, carried the day a lot of the ways.
I just never would want to take away from the chairman, Dan Yardley, because he was remarkable.
Yeah, he was a terrific guy, wasn't he? Now, you know, I want to mention this, and then we'll bridge off into local government here. But the leadership of the number of women in the legislature, and speak to that constitutional thing when we had 19 constitutional delegates who were women. And then we'd only had 2 women,
right.
You know, in the legislature prior to that, with you and Tony Rozelle, at least in '71. Now, by the way, in '69 there were 3, I think it was, or '67. So it wasn't always 2, but the numbers that we came up with was that in 1965 there were 3 women legislators. In '67 there were 3. In '69 Tony was the only one. Tony Rozelle was the only one. Then you joined, and there were 2 in 1971. And then right late in the middle of that was 19 members of the Constitutional Convention. And then it exploded, and suddenly in '73 there were 9, and in '75 there were 14, and in '77 there were 14, and in '79 there were 15. Now those still aren't good enough numbers, but they were a huge improvement on 2 and 3. Which were where we were.
Well, that was a big improvement, but today we're still sitting at 28% of women members of the Montana legislature,
28%.
And that's roughly 32 or 33 women, something like that. I don't have the exact number. So while that's much bigger than 2, or sticking around that 1% level, it tells you very clearly that we have a long ways to go to get more women in office, and that was one of the chief issues that we all worked on, was to get more women elected, not just at the legislative level, but also at the local government level, city commission. We made progress,
but we haven't gone
We're
far
not
enough.
finished.
Yeah.
We are not finished.
Yeah.
We still have a lot of work to do. It's still hard for women to run campaigns. It's hard for them to raise money, and it's not easy for them to get elected either. So we've made progress, but we still have issues ahead of us.
I happen to be a believer that having this large majority of men in public office has not necessarily solved all the problems of America or Montana.
Well, we'd like our shot. Can we say that? Can we say that? We would like our shot.
Now, from a local government perspective, you were a real pathfinder in a sense. You were elected to the county commission. Now, if I can think of a place where women would be probably totally unwelcome, it would be the county commission in every county. Tell us about your efforts starting there, and then where
All right. Well, I was appointed by Judge Gary to fill a vacancy on the county commission in 1984, and there was an uproar when we were being considered, that a group of leaders in the community, farmers and ranchers mostly, were quoted in the newspaper of saying, this is no job for a woman. And women don't know anything about heavy equipment, and that we wanted a farmer and a rancher and a man. And it was a huge controversy, and it went on to the point where the district court judges, who back in those days had the authority to make the appointment, that's changed since, met with a friend of theirs who was their age, who was a member of their country club, and secretly met with him and decided that they would appoint him till the next general election. And all hell broke loose. And it was women who were furious that this was going on. The secret got out, and they burned up the phone lines to the judges, telling them that not only I, but the other potential candidate, Kenny Bottomley, had received the endorsement of the Central Committee and recommending either of us would be very appropriately to be appointed. And it went on for weeks. And finally, Judge Gary relented. And he said, we did it in secret, we didn't follow the open meetings laws, and we were wrong. And he decided that he would appoint me. And Judge Olson deferred to the senior judge. And so I was appointed in 1984 in the spring and had to run in November to win the last 2 years of that term. And back then, women, there were 13 female county commissioners in the state and 172 male county commissioners. You're right, it was the absolute last bastion of male-dominant environment, politics. That was we represented 7%. And in 85 now, I checked, of 2014, of the 131 total county commissioners, 98 are male and 33 are females. So we've increased our representation to 25%. But when you think, wow, that's a huge change. That was 29 years, and women have increased their representation as county commissioners 0.5% per year for 29 years. So there's still work to be done.
Progress is tough sometimes,
Oh
but
my.
you look at it and think, well, on pure numbers, this is a job that's not done, and we really, as a society, need to, stay with it. But there are forces that still don't like the idea.
Oh my, we had commissioners in Judith Basin County, very elderly gentleman who swore when Barbara Skelton was running for county commissioner that if she was elected, he would leave. He would not work with a woman. And so the day after the election, she just strolled right in and said, okay, Arnie, I'm here, take it or leave it. And they became friends. And in fact, when we had state association meetings of county commissioners, all of the few of us 13 women who were county commissioners always made it a point to sit and have lunch with Arnie. He was surrounded by women, and he loved it.
Yeah.
He loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it was a very tough environment for us. We started having at our annual meeting Women in Mako breakfast, just so we could get to know each other. We were such a tiny little proportion of the people in the association, and the men went bonkers. They were furious. They heard us laughing at our breakfast. We were telling our stories and sharing stories, and they thought we were talking about them. And they actually put a motion on the floor of the convention to end Women in Mako breakfast. That's how threatened they were by 7% of their association.
Now, when we look at this thing, we're looking forward to the current time. And
Yes.
then part of the context of this series, by the way, is that we made a lot of progressive change in the 1970s. And one of the challenges is not to slide back. And in the case of women in the public arena, we still haven't gotten there. So that's part of the larger context of what we always want to talk about. Would you say that now at the county commission level, is the problem now with the commissioners who are male as opposed to female, or is it with the electorate? I mean,
Perhaps both.
Yeah.
It has changed. Since that time, MACO, the Montana Association of Counties, elected the first female president of the association, the elegant Hill County Commissioner Toni Hagener.
Who was a guest on one of our programs here,
Yes,
by the
and
way.
she was such a wonderful example of excellence. And she was followed by Anne Mary Dusso was elected president, and I was elected president in '94. And subsequently, there are a lot more women in leadership in the state association. So there's been tremendous progress on that end. I think in terms of the electorate, I think the gender is less a detriment than it was. But the other issue is there are so few women willing to run. And I see that as a problem, not only in county government, but in state and federal government as well. They have not gotten the financial support. There's all sorts of data about reluctance to fund women's campaigns, except for Emily's List. Mm-hmm. And women are just see that this is too tough a hill to climb, I think, in many cases, and have difficulty getting people assuming that they should be leaders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yet, having a seat at the table is critical.
Right.
You know, that really is one of the most important parts of the feminist movement. And congratulations to Jane and Dorothy for being willing to do that. But young women coming up have got to be thinking about these things.
I think about that,
you know?
and I always say that, you know, the only people say, well, why didn't you run for office? I always said the only thing I ever wanted to run for was cover. but
well, there is that.
But the reality is, it takes something to have the guts to put yourself out in the public arena, expose yourself to an up or down vote, and then have to go through what you have to go through. And actually, the political world's getting almost tougher and harsher.
Yeah. Well, that's why groups like the Women's Political Caucus exist, and that's why groups of that sort are there, because they realize that you need extra support in order to run women for office and run them successfully. And one of the things we did in our early feminist efforts in southwestern Montana was to form a chapter of the National Women's Political Caucus in Bozeman, with the idea that we would be there to help fundraise, to do literature drops, to have phone trees, to scream and yell when the judges did the wrong thing, so that would be our focus. There were wonderful women's groups already working in the state who were working on issues, but to get a group that really got behind women candidates, that was the role of the political caucus. So that was one of the things we really wanted to work on.
But one of the amazing things that Jane did was also help us focus on how we were raising our children and what their attitudes were, which has, I think, a lot to do with how you perceive yourself fitting into the big mix when you're an adult. Mm-hmm. And the work that she did in that regard was absolutely startling and eye-opening to most of us.
This is before she was a county commissioner,
Well
right?
before.
That's when she had little kids at home.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So shall we hearken back to some of that?
Yeah,
What
it's
you-
Yeah,
what you
very
found?
interesting.
I think it's important because I think it's gives a good picture of the cultural environment that we were living in the 70s. When I moved to Bozeman in 1973, and the Women's Political Caucus was already up and running, they were the movers and shakers and very involved. And I had a brand new baby, and a 5-year-old. And I had been a grade school teacher in the past, and they recruited me to conduct a study of sexism in grade school readers, K through 6. And I partnered with Dr. Louise Hale, who was a sociologist, and she designed this study. And the Bozeman School Board was initially interested in cooperating with that, and after the word got out they were going to cooperate, they decided that that was too controversial. So we just did it anyway, without them. And uppity women that we were.
You know, better to beg forgiveness than to ask approval
Exactly.
on the front end.
Exactly. They did loan us the textbooks, all of the grade school readers, and the results were so shocking that they were headlined all over the state. Headline was in the Billings Gazette, "Your mother is a dolt." Here's what we found. The most alarming result was the image of adult women. They were incompetent, they were insensitive, they were belligerent, they were always messing up with the kids' fun. Dads were fun-loving and involved and helpful and employed. And if there was a problem to solve, the children in these readers, now these are our kids from age 5 to 12, 14, we're seeing that their moms couldn't do anything but be an impediment. And there were very few instances of them too. The male numbers of characters in those were outnumbered the girls 2 to 1. The boys were depicted as stronger and smarter than their mothers and all the other female characters. And of the main characters of children, 75.5% were males and 24.5% were females.
3 to 1, so
Yeah.
that's certainly out of
Yeah,
proportion.
and the illustrations were so bizarre too, because you know that from age 5 to 12, you know that the girls are taller and bigger than you, right?
My 6.5-year-old granddaughter, I look at her every day and see how she towers over all the boys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But in the illustrations, the boys are taller. And so that brings up an issue too, that sexism and this kind of false representation of ability and even physical appearance is a detriment to males as well as females. That a little boy sees all of these powerful, smart, active, big guys, and he's a little bitty weeny guy, that reflects very badly for them. And here was one of the most astonishing things. Aside from in one of the books, there were 352 consecutive pages in which there was not one significant female character. What does that tell our kids? Another reader contains 172 consecutive pages without a single significant female. And in the entire text of another reader, only one story had female children as main characters. For 279 pages, there is no female of importance. So that's what it was like then. So I wanted to look at what has changed now, right? We've got the
So you've updated your analysis a
No,
little
I'm not
bit.
doing any more studying of this.
Right.
I'm too busy. But I wish someone else would, to look back at grade school readers again and do this parallel study. But the movie star Geena Davis has created an institute study to show the gender gap in TV and film. And just last month, she put out a report that fewer than 31% of all speaking parts in film and TV worldwide go to women. And women make up only 17% of roles as background characters. That's like on the show The Walking Dead, if you're watching it, look at all the zombies coming at you.
Even women don't get
You
equal
know,
time in
We don't
zombies.
even get to be zombies.
You know, you might make a case that more male zombies would be appropriate.
It would be better.
But it is
anyway.
not proportional for sure.
Right.
But you know, the books that Jane was looking at, those were not books published in
Yeah.
Montana. Those were books
Right.
from national textbook publishers. So it
Right.
wasn't a Bozeman problem, it was a national problem.
Right.
I think the
suspect
sociology, again, to make legal changes, which is often the place where we go who try to do it because we can control that.
Right.
Where, how do you control the sociology? How do you control the broader political world? You can go into a legislative body and actually pass a law, sometimes over the objections of the broader political world, the broader sociological context. And yet, getting that to catch up with the law is sometimes a challenge.
Right.
Yes,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, when we get the,
We used to use the word consciousness raising. I don't hear it very much anymore, but it was the idea that people would have different views about women and women's role in society. And it doesn't come easily. Laws are terribly important, but they do not change generations of tradition in the way in which people view one another. So it's a continuing struggle for us. And I know that young women today think that feminism is not an issue anymore, that it's all okay, it's fine, we're going to be treated just as we should be treated. But those are fragile gains and not things that should be taken lightly.
You know, time's flying as we're going forward, so I want to dive back into one of the preeminent issues of law in Montana and have us kind of spend some time and get our teeth into that, and that is the Equal Rights Amendment.
Right, we're ready.
We obviously had a strong provision in the Montana Constitution, but the federal Constitution, people wonder about that, but thank you for this headline in the Billings Gazette that back here in 1974 we became the 32nd state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. That was only half the battle, because the battle continued well into the late 1970s to rescind that.
That's right.
Let's dive into the ERA here as we keep talking.
We'll be glad to, because that was a big issue for us, for all of us who were involved in numbers of groups in Montana. There was a state Equal Rights Amendment ratification group and then became the state ERA Council. We in Southwest Montana and the Women's Political Caucus threw in with that group, worked with them, worked with the League, worked with lots of organizations. This was Jeanette Rankin's home state. How could we not ratify the Equal Rights Amendment? And we did finally get it done, as the headline said. We were the 32nd state to ratify, and we took a victory lap. You know, we thought things were going to be much different and really great. We were unprepared, I think it's fair to say, with the backlash of people who were completely against the Equal Rights Amendment. They tried to rescind it in the 1975 session, 77, 79, and 81, every opportunity that could be presented. And I'm proud to say, thanks to the work of many, many, many people in this state, Montana never did rescind the Equal Rights Amendment, so we are among those states that both ratified and maintained the ratification. But the arguments that came up against the ERA were really attempting to make women fearful about what their futures would be, make women fearful about what would be possible for their daughters. You're all going to be using the same restroom. Your daughters are going to be sent off to fight in Vietnam, which, if you remember, was a huge issue at that particular time. You are going to lose your right to be treated in a polite manner. And these were things that conservative groups who saw an opportunity for a wedge issue, one of the early wedge issues, I think, in the political spectrum, to sort of fire up their base, were able to use, and they brought those arguments into the legislature, and we had close votes in every single one of those rescission efforts. And Dorothy was there for some of them. We were all there testifying. We were all talking to legislators. But we were pretty amazed at how much fear was generated around that amendment. And if I could just recite the wording, it just simply says, equality of rights under the law will not be denied or abridged by any state or the United States on account of sex. That's all that amendment says. It is a very straightforward addition to the national Constitution, and yet it was a subject of huge debate and a great deal of anger and acrimony.
I think the clarity of that language was frightening to some folks, because under that umbrella, think of the change that could be called upon. And then we had external influences coming in here. As I remember when Phyllis Schlafly was her name, was headed up an outfit called the Eagle Forum, and they came in and they played with local Montana conservative family groups and conservative groups to fight back on this thing and try to rescind the thing, that was the
That was the
really
issue.
big battle. I remember that Jack McDonald, who was a state senator, was a Democrat at that time. He later became a Republican later, but Jack was quoted in Time magazine. It was one of the more awkward moments for me as a Montanan to read a quote in Time magazine where a state senator stood on the floor of the Montana Senate and said, if Jesus Christ would have wanted women to be equal, he would have had 6 women apostles and 6 men apostles. What a thing to have us be noted for, that kind of thinking, and yet it was a tough fight.
Well, one of the things I remember is, and I'm always curious to see what makes an issue erupt in the public the way that one did, because in one of the states that was fighting so diligently for the Equal Rights Amendment, they did a poll and went out in the street and read the language that Marilyn gave us of the content, and nobody had a problem with it. But when it came down to the ERA, it was volcanic. It just created terrible furor. And I always wonder, how do you frame things better so people really understand what the nature of the beast is? Because that one became all out of context. And the second thing I would just say is, and I think we all believe in this, people have to keep guard over the rights that they have. It's amazing if you become sort of immune or disinterested, how things can get chipped away. And everything that we have fought for, and even the suffragists, having fought so hard for the vote, like I think of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who worked 60 years to get the women's vote and never got to vote herself. And yet one of the biggest non-voting groups is young women. If we don't stay diligent, those rights will get chipped away. And I hope we can give people that little warning, because they're not necessarily protected forever.
You know, the voter suppression of today, which has found a voice in the Supreme Court and then in a lot of state legislatures, you know, one of the endangered species for voting is women. Because if you look at, for example, in the Texas case, what they've done is they've said, you need a photo ID, and you need to, and by the way, if it has your married name on it and you were divorced and you change your name, you can't use it. So that it is automatically more difficult for women who went through name changes to be able to be eligible to vote in Texas, on purpose. So one of the things we say at the introduction of all these programs is the battle against the established power structure was not easily won. And then we also look at it and say, we don't want to be sliding back. How do we retain what we have? And that is exactly what you're talking about.
And then the ERA, while we didn't get it added to the Constitution, the time limit, even though it was extended, ran out, and it is no longer a big debate, it is still an issue. It's still a very important issue. It's introduced every year into the Congress. There are many people who feel that we will ultimately get an Equal Rights Amendment added to the Constitution. There are ways in which that could be done, some more desirable than others, but we still need that constitutional protection. Women, I think, really do need that constitutional protection because of the backsliding that you're mentioning. And we always felt that we had great protections here in Montana because of our Montana Constitution, but we don't all live in Montana, and there are many states who have many fewer protections. So a federal Equal Rights Amendment is still critical, and it is a great cause for women to take up once again. And I'm hoping that the fact that Montana never rescinded and did ratify, someday that'll be counted and we'll get to 38 states and we will get it added to the Constitution.
We are at 35.
We're at 35 which have
states.
ratified, that's correct. And there's an issue about whether the rescissions can be counted or not. But with 3 more states, we would be there. So one thing that could happen is maybe they'll take the time limit off, and then we'd have more time to get it done. I still think it's a battle worth fighting, and I think for all the reasons Dorothy has just mentioned and the things that Jane has talked about in terms of some progress but not extraordinary progress, we still need constitutional protections.
You know, and while we have good language here in Montana, I guess it's not, if we care about the whole country. And again, there's not enough protection completely in our language either. We have to fight for our language in the Constitution to have the meaning that it has. And there's always efforts to have some retrenchment on that, that happen in every legislature. And it requires a vigilance, without question. that we just can't be sliding back on these rights.
And we're still here and we're still active, but we want to get the word out that we're not going to be here forever. We're a little tired, you know? We're not able to put in the days we once did. And so we really do want to see young women coming up. And we do see examples of it all the time. It's not that it never happens. If you're in a university community, you certainly see it. But we need to see more. We need to see much more.
Well, there are many issues, the economic glass ceiling, the promotion issues, the pay issues are still in the forefront, still being fought against. You know, I love to see the diminishment of, well, you know, it really isn't just 79%. It's maybe 83%. Well, okay. Well, what if it is 83? You know, that's not
We're still
even
not there.
Steven, you know.
Right.
And having, you know, I have 3 daughters, and I can assure you that they remind me constantly about the inequalities that exist. And but count me as a firm believer that I think, frankly, we'd be all better off if not only if the economics were even, but if the political stuff was even. And you ask the question, I want to make an observation, how does something become a cause celeb when you read it to the real world and you know, some people refer to it as, well, the grassroots are speaking up. Well, the grassroots agree with the language, okay? But there's that astroturf process rather than grassroots, which is that political power in today's age buys a version of the truth that is different than the real truth. It happens every day. Money, whether it be the Koch brothers, I'm going to be a little bit political, but people who want to have their economic and social and political advantages maintained, spend money to create a alternative reality, a truth that is not the truth. But
and it's often a fearful reality. I think that that's one of the
Fear
critical
is a big
issues. Fear is usually a big motivating factor to get some base of people upset and excited about things. And in the case of the ERA, religion, I'm sorry to say, was often used. It was suggested that you couldn't be a good Christian if you favored the Equal Rights Amendment because there was not biblical support for equality. And that was a completely undocumented and ridiculous kind of series of statements, and yet it made people fearful. I go to church, I try to be a good person, and they're telling me if there's an ERA, I can't be a Christian. These are very, very heady charges to make, and they are frightening to people. And I have little respect for organizations which use that method of changing people's minds.
It is intriguing to watch this whole process, but in looking in summation on this issue as we move forward, obviously we had a great history to start with about Jeanette Rankin, about voting rights in Montana. We had then a huge period where there was nothing extraordinary. In fact, there was oppression, and people who were fighting to get equality met with nothing but resistance. We did have a renewed period of progressivity in the 1970s. Wonderful progress with the Constitution, with statutes, with the implementation of the Constitution, rights being laid out, the sociology changing somewhat, the whole image changing. But we are still constantly challenged to pull back from that. I mean, I think it's fair to say that's kind of where we stand. And again, one of the things about in the crucible of change is to recognize that we became a state that was better, and we have to avoid losing that. We have to avoid the sliding back. Well, thank you. We reached the end of a fast hour.
Thank you.
And this is all such fascinating material, and you are extraordinary panelists and extraordinary Montanans. And I want to tell you how much we appreciate having each and every one of you here on in the Crucible of Change. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next program.